A cartoon family was sketched out in a lobby waiting room in 1987 by a man who had gone there to pitch a completely different show. The drawings were so rough that the animators who brought them to life simply traced over them rather than cleaning them up, and the crude result became one of the most recognizable visual styles in television history. By 1990, a single fictional 10-year-old boy had become so famous that the sitting president of the United States named him from a podium as a threat to the American family. 3 days later, the show fired back on live television. There is the voice actor whose two beloved characters were quietly retired forever after his murder in 1998. There is the cast that came within hours of being replaced by strangers. There is the theme song composed in a car on a single drive home. And there is the show that was already being called a fading disappointment before it had been on the air for 10 years, and that is still producing new episodes today. Welcome to Yellowfan. Let's get started. Before Springfield, there was a rabbit. Something has to exist before the thing everyone remembers. Every landmark building had a previous owner. Every beloved song had a rough demo recorded in someone's bedroom. Every television show that eventually changed how millions of people spent their Sunday evenings had a creator who, before any of that, was just a young man with very little money and a drawing he made to complain about his life. Matt Groening was born on February 15, 1954, in Portland, Oregon. He was the middle child in a family of 5 siblings, with an older brother named Mark and an older sister named Patty, and 2 younger sisters he would eventually name cartoon characters after. The younger sisters were Lisa, born in 1956, and Maggie, born in 1958. His father was named Homer, his mother's name was Margaret, and most people who knew her called her Marge. The family lived on a street in Portland called Evergreen Terrace. All of this would matter enormously later. For the time being, it was just a family in Oregon, in a house on a street, with a father who worked as a cartoonist and filmmaker, and who brought paper and pens home to encourage his children to draw. Groening was an odd child in the way that people who later create strange and enduring things tend to be. He drew constantly, in school, in notebooks, in the margins of assignments, in places teachers disapproved of. He was sent to write sentences on the board as punishment for disrupting class. He got his doodles torn up by teachers who thought he was wasting time. His relationship with authority was complicated from the very beginning, which would eventually matter quite a lot, because the show he would create was, at its core, a show built around the suspicion that the people in charge were usually either wrong or self-serving, or both. He attended Evergreen State College in Washington, where he studied and argued and became editor of the school newspaper, and where he met another cartoonist named Linda Barry, whose loose and personal drawing style influenced him in ways he would later talk about in interviews. After graduating in 1977, Groening made the decision that seemed obvious to him and catastrophic to anyone watching from the outside. He moved to Los Angeles to try to become a writer. The city was not welcoming. The jobs he found in those early years were the kind that serious writers in serious films about struggling artists always seem to end up doing. He worked as a chauffeur, driving people around a city that had no interest in what he was trying to accomplish. He worked as a dishwasher. He worked in a record store called Licorice Pizza, which at least had a good name. He was barely paying rent. He was, by his own later description, in a borderline depression during this period, living in a crappy apartment, watching his dreams about becoming a serious writer collide with the reality of Southern California, which had decided not to care about his ambitions. What he did to survive it was draw. He had always drawn, but now he drew with a specific purpose, which was to process, out loud on paper, how miserable it was to be young and broke and invisible in a city that was full of people who were supposedly making it. He started putting his drawings together into small self-published booklets, which he would give away to friends and sell for $2 out of the record store. The strips featured a cartoon rabbit named Binky, who served as a stand-in for Groening himself, and who spent most of his time being defeated by the ordinary structures of adult life. The strip was called Life in Hell. Life in Hell was not a happy comic. It was not designed to be soothing. It was designed to give voice to the frustration of someone who felt trapped by a world that had not turned out the way he had been told it would. Binky faced dead-end jobs and failing relationships and the general indignity of existing without enough money or recognition in a city that rewarded neither honesty nor talent as consistently as it rewarded the right connections. Groening would later say that the strip was his way of turning his own unhappiness into something that had a shape, something other people could look at and recognize in themselves. By 1978, the strip had found its first real publication. A small avant-garde magazine in Los Angeles called Wet ran several strips, giving Groening his first professional cartoon sale. The appearance was small, but it mattered. It meant the drawings could reach people who had not met him, people who had no obligation to be kind about what they saw, and those people responded. Then came the Los Angeles Reader. Groening had found work at this this alternative weekly newspaper, cycling through a series of roles that included delivering papers, typesetting, editing, and writing music criticism. He showed his strips to the editor, a man named James Vowell. The editor looked at the crude, anxious, one-eared rabbit and his miserable life in a city designed to grind people down, and decided to run the strip weekly. Starting on April 25, 1980, Life in Hell appeared in the Reader every week. The editor reportedly came out of his office after first seeing Groening's work and told a colleague that the man behind those cartoons was going to be famous someday. He was not wrong. The strip spread slowly but steadily through the alternative press. By 1986, it was running in roughly 250 weekly papers around the country. It had grown to include more characters. There was Binky's one-eared son Bongo, who appeared to be kept in an empty room for reasons the strip never fully explained. There were two identical fez-wearing figures named Akbar and Jeff, who bickered constantly. The strip did not become a massive mainstream success. It remained a beloved and specific thing, the kind of work that the right kind of reader stumbled across and felt immediately claimed by. Groening had found, in other words, a real audience. He had not found a living. The Life in Hell operation stayed small, sustained partly by a growing line of books and merchandise that Groening and his then-girlfriend Deborah Kaplan, who also worked at the Reader, had assembled into a modest cottage industry. Then a copy of one of the strips reached a man named James L. Brooks. Brooks was not simply a successful producer. He was, by the mid-1980s, one of the most accomplished people in American entertainment. He had co-created The Mary Tyler Moore Show and Taxi, two of the best sitcoms of the 1970s. He had moved into film and won critical and commercial success there as well. He was exactly the kind of established, powerful figure who had no obvious reason to pay attention to a self-published rabbit comic from an alternative newspaper, but a producer named Polly Platt had given Brooks one of Groening's strips as a gift. The specific strip was called The Los Angeles Way of Death, which listed, in Groening's deadpan style, various ways that the city would eventually kill whoever was unlucky enough to live there. Brooks read it and found the tone interesting. By 1985, he had reached out to Groening about potentially working together on something. That something turned out to be a television variety show. Brooks was helping to develop a new program for the fledgling Fox Broadcasting Company. The show was called The Tracey Ullman Show. It was a sketch comedy format built around the British comedian Tracey Ullman, and it needed something to fill the space between commercial breaks. Brooks wanted short animated wraparound segments, what producers at the time called bumpers, and he thought Groening's voice might be right for them. Groening was asked to come in and pitch an idea. His original plan was to pitch an animated version of Life in Hell. The rabbit and his miserable companions would translate to television, and the whole thing would be a natural extension of the work he had already been doing. He was thinking about this when he arrived at the meeting and sat down in the lobby to wait. What happened next has been told many times, and the exact details depend slightly on who is doing the telling. Groening himself has said that it happened in the lobby while he was waiting for the meeting to begin. The version he has told most consistently is that he was sitting there, about to go in and pitch his Life in Hell characters, when he realized something that stopped him cold. If he handed over the animated rights to Binky and the others, he would be giving up control of work that had taken him years to build. The strip was his in a way that nothing in a television deal was ever really going to be, and beyond the question of ownership, there was a more practical anxiety. If the television version failed, it might take the comic strip down with it. Life in Hell was the one thing he had. He was not ready to risk it, so sitting in that lobby, in the few minutes before he was called in to pitch, Groening made up a new family. He drew quickly, sketching out rough figures that became a father, a mother, and 3 children. He named them after his own family, because his own family names were right there in his head, and he was working fast, and those names felt right. The father was Homer, same as his real father. The mother was Marge, same as his real mother. The 2 daughters were Lisa and Maggie, same as his 2 younger sisters. For the son, he chose Bart, an anagram of the word brat, partly because naming a character after himself felt too obvious, and partly because Bart caught something he recognized in his own childhood relationship with rules and authority. He submitted these sketches. The animators who received them, 3 recent graduates of the California Institute of the Arts named Bill Kopp, Wes Archer, and David Silverman, worked from Groening's rough drawings with a single week's production time per short. They assumed, reasonably, that the drawings were placeholders, and that someone would clean them up before they were used. Nobody did. The animators simply traced over what Groening had given them. The crude, slightly misshapen figures that appeared on television on April 19, 1987, in the very first Simpson family short, looked that way because the preliminary sketches were also the final product. The odd proportions, the wobbly lines, the sense that these characters had been put together in a hurry by someone who was not primarily a character designer for television, were all completely completely accurate impressions, because that is more or less exactly what had happened. A colorist on the show named Georgie Palouse was faced with the question of what color to make the family. She noticed that Bart and Lisa and Maggie had no visible hairlines, which meant that if she colored their skin as a normal flesh tone, the top of each head would look strange, blurring into the color above it in a way that read as odd rather than stylized. Palouse decided to make the skin yellow. Groening saw the result and responded immediately. The image of a blue-haired woman against yellow skin was, in his view, immediately and deeply funny. He approved the choice on the spot. The yellow skin that would eventually become one of the most recognizable visual signatures in the history of animation was a solution to a practical problem, proposed by a colorist whose name most viewers would never learn, and accepted in a single decision by a creator who had been working in a lobby 20 minutes before pitching a cartoon family he had just invented. The shorts ran. Audiences responded. The segments were short, usually under a minute, and they were rough in a way that made them feel alive rather than polished. A family was visible in them, recognizable in its dysfunction even in its crudest form. The father was impatient and loud. The mother was patient and slightly exasperated. The children bickered. Small moments of real feeling appeared in between the chaos. The kind of small feelings that good comedy had always been able to carry without announcing itself. By the end of the first season of The Tracey Ullman Show, the Simpson bumpers had become the most popular part of the program. The people at Fox began to ask a question that questions of that kind almost always end up asking. Could this be a show on its own? Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The family began as rough sketches drawn in a lobby, named after people who had no idea they were about to become cartoon characters, and colored yellow to solve a production problem nobody had anticipated. Next, the story of how those sketches became a television show, and the small group of writers who had to figure out what that show actually was. Section 2. 13 episodes and the man who built the room. What it did not yet have, in those months between the success of the Tracey Ullman shorts and the production of the full half-hour series, was a sensibility. That word gets used loosely in conversations about creative work, but what it means in practice is something specific and hard to manufacture. A sensibility is the set of decisions a room full of writers makes, usually without fully articulating why, about what the work believes, what it cares about, what it finds funny, and what it refuses to do. Getting that right is what separates shows that run for a season from shows that run for decades. The person most responsible for defining that sensibility in the early years of The Simpsons was not Matt Groening. Groening had created the family and would remain central to the show's identity as its public face and creative guardian for as long as it ran. But Groening, by his own admission, had no experience running a television production. The writing room was not his area. James L. Brooks, for his part, was occupied with a film career that demanded his attention in ways that left him unable to oversee the show's daily operations. Brooks was essential to the show's existence and its creative protection, negotiating a provision with Fox that prevented the network from interfering with content, which was an almost unheard of concession at the time. But the hour-to-hour work of building a writing room and making it produce consistently excellent material was going to require someone else. That someone else was Sam Simon. Simon had come up through the writers' rooms of some of the best sitcoms of the previous decade. He had worked on Taxi, the acclaimed ABC comedy that had developed a reputation for mixing genuine character work with sharp comedy in ways that felt earned rather than manufactured. He had worked on Cheers. He knew how to run a room, knew how to coax a script out of an argument, knew what it felt like when a joke landed for the right reason, and what it felt like when a joke landed for the wrong one. Brooks brought Simon onto The Simpsons as showrunner, the person who would function as head writer and manager of the production's daily creative life. What Simon did in those first seasons was build the infrastructure of everything. He assembled the initial writing staff, gathering a group of young writers with backgrounds that leaned heavily toward a particular kind of comedy: smart, specific, character-rooted, and not interested in the easy joke when a harder one was available. The original writing team he put together included Al Jean and Mike Reiss, who would later become showrunners themselves, and who would define much of the show's middle period. It included George Meyer, who would go on to be regarded by many people who worked with him as the single most influential writer the show ever had, a man so deeply embedded in the room's comic logic that his departure in 2004 felt to longtime observers like a structural change in the building itself. It included John Swartzwelder, who would eventually be credited with 60 episodes of The Simpsons, more than any other writer in the show's history, and who wrote in a style so precise and strange and perfectly calibrated that other writers would later struggle to describe exactly how he did it. And it included John Vitti, Jay Kogan, Wallace Wolodarski, and Jeff Martin, all of whom would contribute to the show's most most celebrated seasons. Simon has been described by various people who worked with him in terms that don't quite agree with each other, but that circle around the same central truth. Brad Bird, who directed several early episodes before going on to make the animated films The Iron Giant and The Incredibles, called Simon the unsung hero of the show. Writer Ken Levine said Simon was the real creative force, the person who determined the tone, the storytelling approach, the level of ambition the writers held themselves to. Writer John Vitti said later that telling the story of The Simpsons without fully accounting for Sam Simon was telling the managed version of that story, because Simon was the person the writers were writing for. The taste they were trying to satisfy, the judgment they were trying to meet, was his. Simon also had an approach to character that proved essential. He pushed the writing staff to treat the Simpson family as real people rather than comic types. Homer was not simply a buffoon. He was a man with genuine feelings underneath the stupidity, a person whose love for his family was real, even when his ability to express it was catastrophically limited. Marge was not simply a straight woman reacting to chaos. She was a person with her own interior life, her own frustrations and desires, her own sense of humor that appeared quietly when the scripts allowed it. The children were not simply vehicles for jokes. Bart had real feelings of inadequacy beneath the bravado. Lisa carried real loneliness inside her intelligence. Even Maggie, who never spoke, was treated as a full character with consistent interior logic. This approach to character gave the show its emotional weight. The Simpsons could be genuinely funny in a way that few television comedies had managed, partly because the jokes were grounded in people who felt real. When something went wrong for Homer, there was actual feeling in the disaster, not just a setup for a punchline. When Bart wanted something he could not have, the wanting felt true. This combination of genuine comedy and genuine feeling was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate philosophy developed in the writing room under Simon's supervision about what the show was supposed to do and who it was supposed to be about. The relationship between Simon and Groening was, by multiple accounts, deeply complicated. Groening has described it as a collaboration that began well and gradually became contentious. Simon, for his part, appears to have felt that his contributions were being under-acknowledged. As the show became more successful and Groening became more famous, Simon resented what he saw as an imbalance in the credit the outside world assigned to each of them. The press gravitated toward Groening as the creator, the man whose name went on the comic strip and whose face appeared at the panels and whose story about sketching a family in a lobby had become the origin myth everyone repeated. Simon felt, and was not entirely wrong to feel, that the show's actual character had been shaped in the writing room more than in any lobby. The tension between them ran through the first 4 seasons and ended with Simon's departure in 1993. Before he left, he negotiated an agreement with the production that would define his relationship to the show for the rest of his life. He secured a share of the show's profits to be paid every year going forward, and an executive producer credit that would appear on every subsequent episode despite the fact that he would never work on the show again. For as long as The Simpsons ran, Simon's name appeared in the credits of every Treehouse of Horror special under a rotating series of variations on his name, each one a small joke with a slight edge to it. The arrangement was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable deals in the history of American television. Sam Simon was paid for the rest of his life for work he had stopped doing in the show's 4th season. He died in March of 2015, having spent his later years giving most of that money away to animal rights causes and other charitable work, and the executive producer credit disappeared from the show only at that point. But before all of that, before the tension and the departure and the negotiated exit, Simon's team made a pilot, and the pilot did not work. The first episode produced for the standalone series, a half-hour episode titled Some Enchanted Evening, was intended to be the show's premiere. The animation came back from Klasky's C Chupo, the production house handling the domestic animation work, and the result was bad enough to alarm everyone in a serious way. The characters moved incorrectly. The timing was wrong. What should have been a smooth and confident debut episode looked like a technical failure. The producers rejected the animation and sent it back for corrections. The delay meant the episode could not air on schedule. The premiere would need to be something else. The something else turned out to be a Christmas special. Writer Mimi Pond was assigned the episode, which followed Homer's attempt to earn extra money working as a mall Santa Claus after Mr. Burns denied the plant workers their Christmas bonuses. The episode ended at a dog racing track, with Homer adopting an 8-to-1 shot named Santa's Little Helper after the dog lost his race and was abandoned by his owner. The Simpson family went home with a dog and a sense that things would probably be fine. The episode was called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, and it aired on December 17, 1989. 33 million people watched it. That number requires a moment. 33 million viewers for the premiere premiere of a primetime animated series on a network that most of the country still thought of as a minor operation trying to compete with the established broadcasters. Fox was not NBC or CBS or ABC. It had been founded only 3 years earlier and was still being treated by much of the industry as a curiosity rather than a genuine competitor. The Simpsons gave Fox something it had not yet had in any real sense, which was a television event. The show's first season ended with Fox becoming the first network to place a new series in the top 30 rated shows of the season. That had not happened before for Fox, and it would not have happened without the Yellow family from Springfield. The production work was divided between Klasky Supo for the domestic elements and Animation Studios in South Korea for the actual frame-by-frame drawing, arrangement that was common in the industry but that created its own challenges around quality control and communication across time zones and language barriers. The first 2 seasons carry a look that longtime fans can identify immediately, a slightly wobbly, sometimes rubbery quality to the movement that reflects both the speed of production and the limitations of the arrangement. By the 3rd season, when the animation company was switched from Klasky Seichupo to Film Roman, the visual style had settled into something smoother, more consistent, and more expressive. Al John and Mike Reese became showrunners for the 3rd season, taking over from the arrangement that had defined the first 2 years. Their seasons are remembered as among the show's very best, and their tenure produced episodes that would appear on best-of lists for decades afterward. The 3rd season contained Homer at the Bat, which assembled 9 active Major League Baseball players for a story about the Springfield nuclear plant's company softball team. It contained Flaming Moe's, a story about a drink that Homer invented and Moe stole, which managed to be simultaneously a sharp piece of commercial satire and a genuinely moving story about credit and friendship. Through these early seasons, the show developed something that no formula or writing guide could fully explain. The Springfield of the first few years felt like a real place. Its geography made a kind of dream sense. Its citizens had consistent personalities that could be stacked against each other in ways that produced new results. The recurring characters who populated the town, Ned Flanders and his earnest Christianity, Principal Skinner and his buried life, Moe and his bottomless sourness, Chief Wiggum and his spectacular incompetence, were not types. They were people, observed from a particular angle, with whole histories visible behind the moments the camera found them in. The voice cast contributed to this in ways that go beyond the obvious observation that the actors were talented. Dan Castellaneta had developed Homer's voice through a process of trial and error that began during the Tracy Ullman years. He had originally tried to base the voice on the actor Walter Matthau, a low, slow, slightly weary delivery that felt plausible for a working man of Homer's generation. The problem was that the Matthau voice was difficult to sustain across the emotional range that Homer required. It could manage gruffness but not joy, could manage irritation but not panic. Castellaneta gradually simplified and deepened the voice until it settled into the Homer that audiences came to recognize. Warmer and more elastic, capable of moving from irritation to enthusiasm to genuine tenderness without any of the transitions feeling forced. Julie Kavner brought a similar texture to Marge, a slightly nasal quality that she has said reflects a specific tension the character carries, a woman who is holding a great deal together at all times and is not entirely sure what would happen if she let go. Nancy Cartwright had auditioned for the role of Lisa, but decided in the booth that she wanted Bart instead, delivering something so immediate and so right that she was hired on the spot. The producers then cast the then relatively unknown Yeardley Smith as Lisa, a choice that gave the character a voice of unusual clarity, earnest and precise, in a way that matched Lisa's personality, without ever tipping into parody. Harry Shearer and Hank Azaria between them covered an enormous portion of the supporting cast, each capable of producing distinct and consistent voices across dozens of separate characters per season. The writing staff worked through a process of collective rewriting that has been described by nearly everyone who participated in it as unlike anything else in television. An episode would begin with a credited writer's first draft, but that draft would then move into a room where the entire staff sat together and rebuilt it, joke by joke and scene by scene, until what emerged was a consensus product. The credited writer might not recognize every line in the final script. The process was occasionally brutal and occasionally exhilarating, and produced something that no single writer working alone could have produced, because it combined sensibilities that would have remained separate under any other system. By the end of the 4th season, the show had established itself so completely that the question of whether it would continue was no longer being asked by anyone. The question had shifted to something more interesting, which was how long a show working at this level could maintain it. The writers and producers who had built Springfield from a collection of rough lobby sketches into a fully imagined world were aware, in the way that people at the top of something always are, that there would was only one direction available from where they were standing. They were working at the peak of what the form could do. They were also working inside a system that produced 22 episodes per season and would keep producing them as long as the audience showed up, which meant the engine had to keep running even if the fuel was eventually going to run low. That awareness sits under the first 4 seasons like a quiet hum. The room knew how good it was. It also knew what good things eventually became. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The writing room that Sam Simon built produced television that almost nobody had attempted before at that level, and the cast that recorded it gave it a life that drawings alone could never have provided. Next comes the moment the whole country stopped and noticed, when a 10-year-old cartoon boy became the most famous child in America. Section 3. The boy who scared the president. Popularity. When it arrives suddenly for something that was not supposed to be popular, tends to arrive in a way that feels slightly out of control. The people responsible for the thing are not ready for it, because they were not planning for it. They were planning to do their work and hope for a reasonable audience. When the audience turns out to be enormous, the thing that was made carefully and quietly inside a room gets carried out into a world that handles it roughly, projects meanings onto it that were never intended, and sometimes turns it into a symbol of something the creators never agreed to represent. That is what happened to Bart Simpson in 1990. The show had been on the air for less than a year. The first season had performed well enough for Fox to feel confident about its future, but the scale of what was about to happen had not been predicted by anyone, including the people who made it. Then the summer of 1990 arrived, and something shifted. The merchandising had started before the first full season even finished. Bart's face, his spiky silhouette, his catchphrases, had made it onto t-shirts and buttons and posters before most of the country had seen more than a handful of episodes. The phrases themselves were part of the appeal. They had the quality of things a person could say out loud to signal something about themselves, a willingness to be irreverent, a suspicion of authority, a refusal to take the expectations of adults too seriously. The shirts with the phrases sold fast. Then they sold faster. By the summer of 1990, sources at the time estimated that as many as 1 million Bart Simpson t-shirts were being sold on certain single days. The total merchandise revenue for the show in its first 14 months of sales reached figures around $2 billion. In the fall of that year, stores opened that sold nothing but Simpsons merchandise, which was its own remarkable indicator of how large the phenomenon had become. The bootleg market ran alongside the official one, as it always does when something becomes that big that fast. Independent vendors made their own Bart shirts, many of which took the character in directions the show's creators had not sanctioned and would not have chosen. There were versions that put Bart in the company of other popular characters from movies and other cartoons. There were versions that inserted him into political commentary about the Gulf War. There were versions that reimagined him in ways that became their own small controversy. The bootleg shirts circulated in flea markets and on street corners, and the official licensing operation had neither the time nor the resources to fully contain them. Years later, Matt Groening would say in interviews that he actually enjoyed some of the bootleg designs, which was either magnanimous or resigned or both. The schools noticed. Across the United States, principals and teachers and parent groups began raising objections to Bart Simpson t-shirts appearing in their buildings. The specific phrases on the shirts were the problem. A shirt that told the world the wearer was a proud underachiever was not, in the view of many educators, appropriate messaging for an elementary school hallway. The phrase about who the hell you are was similarly unwelcome in schools that had dress codes and values statements and morning assemblies where a certain kind of language was not supposed to be part of the atmosphere. Bans spread through school districts in multiple states. The controversy generated news coverage, which generated more attention for the shirts, which generated more sales, which generated more controversy, in the loop that this kind of moral panic tends to produce. Entertainment Weekly, at the end of 1990, named Bart Simpson its Entertainer of the Year. The publication's summary of why captured something real about what made the character work. Bart had proved, the piece said, to be a rebel who was also a good kid, a terror who was easily terrorized, and a flake who occasionally astonished everyone, including himself, with genuine fortitude. That complexity was the thing the school band crowd missed, and the show's admirers understood. Bart was not simply a bad influence. He was a specific kind of child, the kind that had always existed and that most adults recognized from their own childhoods. The kid who pushed against things partly because pushing was the only honest response he had to a world that kept demanding compliance. The show had found a way to make that kid sympathetic rather than simply disruptive, which was the harder and more interesting achievement. By November of 1990, the cultural moment had reached the kind of scale that gets measured in parade balloons. The Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade that year sent a Bart Simpson balloon down around the streets of New York City. The balloon was 67 feet tall and 34 feet wide and weighed 750 pounds. Getting it inflated properly the night before the parade had been a genuine challenge, because the company that built it was not experienced in making balloons at the scale the Macy's parade demanded, and the stitching had begun to fail and leak helium in the early morning hours before the event. Workers managed to stop the leak in time. Bart floated through Manhattan on Thanksgiving morning, a year after the show had first aired, visible to the crowds on the street and to millions watching on television at home. The episode of The Simpsons that aired the same day, a story about Bart's conflicts with the family during Thanksgiving, included a self-referential joke in which Homer told Bart that turning every popular cartoon character into a parade balloon would turn the whole event into a farce. Behind Homer, briefly visible on the television in the scene, was a Bart Simpson parade balloon. The show was making jokes about its own enormous visibility before the parade it was joking about had even finished. Through this whole period, the creative team back in the writing room had been watching the Bart phenomenon with a mixture of gratitude and unease. The character's outsized public presence was useful in one sense. It kept the show in the conversation and drove audiences to the screen, but it also created a pressure that the show's best work had always been careful to resist. The pressure to be what the audience expected rather than what the writing demanded in any given moment. The Room had spent the first season establishing all 5 members of the family as genuine characters. The Bart mania threatened to reduce the show to a Bart delivery mechanism, a vehicle for putting the spiky-haired kid in situations that confirmed what audiences already believed about him, rather than finding new things to say. The clearest marker of how serious this pressure had become was a network decision in the summer of 1990 that the producers opposed and could not prevent. Fox, looking at the show's strong first-season numbers and wanting to capitalize on the attention it was receiving, decided to move The Simpsons from its Sunday evening slot to Thursday nights. The new time slot put the show in direct competition with The Cosby Show on NBC, which was the most watched program in the country. The move was, from a creative and competitive standpoint, an act of either confidence or recklessness, depending on who was doing the evaluating. James L. Brooks, speaking about it at the time, said that the show had been doing well on Sunday and that the Thursday move felt to him like being thrown into a fight they had not asked for. He was not optimistic about the outcome. The first episode of the second season was an episode about Bart failing school. It was called Bart Gets an F. The episode had been chosen as the season premiere specifically because it featured Bart prominently, which was exactly the kind of network logic the producers were navigating. The episode aired on October 11th, 1990. The overnight ratings came in and caused something close to a genuine surprise. In terms of household television sets tuned in, The Cosby Show finished ahead, but only barely, by the thinnest sliver of a ratings point. In terms of actual viewers counted by Nielsen, 33.5 million people watched Bart fail his test and break into tears and earn a D- by proving he understood the historical significance of George Washington's defeat at Fort Necessity. The Cosby Show was watched that night by 28.5 million. The Simpsons had, in terms of real human beings looking at a screen, beaten the most dominant family comedy in the country on the same night they shared a time slot for the first time. Entertainment Tonight made the results its lead story the next day. The press treated the ratings as a kind of symbolic passing of the torch, a cartoon family from a network that nobody had taken seriously edging past the show that had defined mainstream family television for most of the decade. Bill Cosby, who had earlier declined to see the show as a genuine competitor, revised his assessment after the results came in. He described Bart as antisocial, angry, confused, and frustrated. The show's producers did not find this damaging. Matt Groening responded that the description sounded accurate and that Bart's refusal to accept that normal was something worth striving for was precisely the point. What happened in the weeks and months after that first Thursday night tells a more complicated story about what the ratings blitz actually meant. The show fell out of the top 10 across the second season. New episodes of The Cosby Show consistently beat new episodes of The Simpsons when they aired head-to-head. The Simpsons spent much of the second season ranked around 38th in the weekly ratings, a sharp fall from the first season's top 30 performance. By the end of that season, The Cosby Show averaged as the 5th highest-rated program on television, while The Simpsons was somewhere in the 30s. The network eventually returned the show to its Sunday slot in 1994, where it remained for decades, but none of that fully captures what was actually happening to the show's cultural weight during those same months. The ratings game and the cultural conversation were running on different tracks. The people who watched The Simpsons talked about it in a way that people do not talk about something they watch out of habit. They quoted it, they argued about it, they compared favorite moments and scenes and secondary characters with a specificity specificity that suggested genuine investment. The show had, in the language that would be used about it for decades, made its audience feel smart for watching it. The jokes rewarded attention. The visual gags often had multiple layers, with background details and throwaway images that revealed themselves only to viewers who were paying close enough attention to notice them. A person who watched The Simpsons carefully felt that the show was watching them back, noticing things about the world that careful observers also noticed, and finding the right way to make those things funny. Then came the most improbable measure of how far the show had traveled from a lobby sketch into the center of American life. On January 27, 1992, the President of the United States mentioned The Simpsons from a podium at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in Washington. George H.W. Bush was in the middle of his re-election campaign, and the central theme of that campaign was the defense of traditional family values, a phrase that had become a significant piece of the cultural conversation of the early 90s. From that podium, Bush told the assembled audience that what America needed was to make its families more like the Waltons and a lot less like The Simpsons. The remark was an attack. It was meant to invoke the show as an emblem of the cultural looseness and moral carelessness that the family values argument was positioned against. The Waltons, a warm and gentle drama about a large rural family navigating the Depression, was everything The Simpsons were not. It was earnest where they were satirical, obedient where Bart was defiant, harmonious where Homer was chaotic. The president had, in front of a large and receptive audience, held up the yellow family from Springfield as a symbol of what was wrong with the direction American society was taking. The show's writers had 3 days to respond before the next broadcast. On January 30th, a scheduled rerun of an earlier episode went out with a new opening sequence attached. The family was shown watching Bush's speech on television. After the president said his line about the Waltons and The Simpsons, Bart looked at the screen and replied that The Simpsons and the Waltons were actually pretty similar, since both families were praying for an end to the Depression. The joke was quick and light and precisely aimed, and it landed. The response got its own news coverage, which generated its own attention, which added another layer to what was already one of the more unusual feuds in the history of American entertainment. 4 years later, in the 7th season, the writing team revisited the feud directly. Writer Bill Oakley had been thinking about the Waltons' remark since the day it was made, waiting for the right moment to address it properly. When he and Josh Weinstein became showrunners for the 7th season, he finally wrote the episode. The result was called Two Bad Neighbors, and it was built around the premise that George and Barbara Bush, by this point out of the White House following their 1992 election defeat, had moved across the street from The Simpsons in Springfield. The episode worked hard not to be a partisan attack. Oakley has said in interviews that the goal was to make it a personal rather than political piece, poking fun at Bush's grumpiness and the friction that arose from two very different personalities living too close to each other, rather than criticizing his policies. Bush was voiced by Harry Shearer, who played him as a cantankerous figure rather than a villain. At the end of the episode, Gerald Ford moved in across the street after Bush left town, and immediately invited Homer over to watch football and share nachos. By the time that episode aired, the show had already been recognized by people who spent their careers thinking about television as something that required serious attention. Time magazine's 1999 issue celebrating the greatest achievements of the 20th century in arts and entertainment named The Simpsons the best television series of the century. In that same issue, Bart Simpson was included among the 100 most important people of the century, the only fictional character on the list. The boy who had been banned from school hallways in 1990 had, by the end of the decade, been formally recognized as one of the most significant cultural figures the century had produced. It is the kind of trajectory that would have seemed absurd to anyone hearing about it in advance, and that felt almost inevitable to anyone watching it unfold in real time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Bartmania turned a cartoon into a cultural war, and a president's offhand remark turned the show into something it had never set out to be, a symbol. Next, the story of the sound that defined a generation, and the man who wrote it on a drive home from a meeting he almost refused to take. Section 4. The Sound of Springfield. Before any episode of The Simpsons could be watched, before the couch gag unfolded, and the family settled in front of their television, and the camera pulled back to reveal the living room, there was a sound. Roughly 60 seconds of music that told the audience something was starting. Something particular. Something that sounded like nothing else on television and that had, from the very first airing, an immediate and distinctive quality that good theme music is supposed to have, but that very few television theme songs in history have actually achieved. The sound was playful and slightly chaotic and had an old quality to it even in 1989, a feeling of something that belonged to an earlier, more eccentric era of American entertainment. It began with a single note played on a synthesizer, synthesizer, and then everything else came rushing in behind it. The strings and the woodwinds and the brass and the percussion, moving in a way that suggested organized mayhem, controlled energy, the sound of a family in motion. It was composed by a man named Danny Elfman, who had not expected to like doing it. Elfman's career up to 1989 had been built around two things. He was the frontman of a band called Oingo Boingo, a Los Angeles group whose sound blended punk sensibility with an almost theatrical strangeness, a carnival quality that set them apart from the other bands of the early 1980s Los Angeles scene. And he had become Tim Burton's composer of choice for film work, having written the scores for Pee-wee's Big Adventure and Beetlejuice, and in the same year as The Simpsons, the score for the first Batman film. His reputation in 1989 was for a specific kind of dark whimsy, music that could hold genuine menace and genuine humor simultaneously, without either quality canceling out the other. His first encounter with Matt Groening predated the commission by several years, and the circumstances were unusual. Groening had been a music critic at the Los Angeles Reader during his years at the paper, and had attended an Oingo Boingo concert and reviewed it in a way that Elfman found unfavorable. The review, Elfman has said in interviews, was written by someone who arrived after the show had started and saw only the encores, which was not an ideal basis for a critical assessment of the full performance. The two men knew of each other through this review, which had not created the warmest possible foundation for a professional relationship. When Groening approached Elfman in 1989 about writing a theme for a new animated television show, Elfman met with him and was given a look at early material from the production. His reaction, by his own later account, was that the show seemed like it might not go anywhere. He told Groening directly that if the intention was to make something contemporary and modern, he was not the right choice for the job. But if the goal was something old-fashioned, something retro in its feel and texture, something that belonged to an earlier world of television and animation, then he was the exact right person. Groening wanted retro. Elfman was hired. Groening had prepared for the meeting by assembling a reference tape, a collection of sounds and styles that pointed toward what he was imagining for the show's theme. The tape included the theme from the Jetsons, several pieces of music by the composer Esquivel, a Frank Zappa jingle recorded for a Remington electric shaver advertisement, some selection of easy listening music, and a record designed to teach parrots to talk. The combination is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals something specific about the kind of sound Groening was after. He wanted eccentricity. He wanted retro. He wanted something that had been made before pop music homogenized, before everything on television began to sound roughly the same. He wanted music that sounded like it could only have come from a very particular and slightly strange mind. Elfman listened to the tape and told Groening he understood exactly what was needed. He left the meeting and drove home. Somewhere during that drive, the theme arrived. The melody came to him in the car, and he hummed it all the way home, and by the time he arrived, he already had the core of what would become one of the most recognizable television themes ever written. He has described the composition process as unusually fast, one of those rare moments in his career when the work simply presented itself rather than requiring the long labor of ordinary creation. Most of his film scores, he has said, were extremely difficult. The Simpsons was not. The melody came out of the car ride and the first genuine impulse he had when thinking about what Groening needed, and then the work of fleshing it out took only a few days beyond that initial flash. The inspiration Elfman has named for the theme's particular texture is The Flintstones, the Hanna-Barbera animated series that ran from 1960 to 1966, and that had its own distinctive theme built around a cheerful brass and percussion swagger. The Simpsons shared with the Flintstones the premise of a working-class family. The father employed at a large industrial operation he did not fully understand and did not particularly enjoy, the household held together by a more capable and patient wife, the children finding ways to create chaos within a domestic world that was supposed to function smoothly. The musical parallel was not accidental. Elfman was reaching for that specific flavor of animated family sitcom confidence, the sound of a show that knew exactly what it was and was comfortable with its own strangeness. The theme was recorded with a full orchestra at the 20th Century Fox lot, and the producers were present for the session. By several accounts, the people in the room were not entirely sure what to make of what they were hearing as it came together. The sound was unusual. It did not match the style of other contemporary television music. James L. Brooks, who walked in during the recording session and listened for a while, eventually delivered an assessment that became part of the story of the session. He said that what he was hearing sounded like lemmings marching to their death, which he appeared to mean as a compliment, a recognition that the music had exactly the quality of cheerful inevitability that the show was going to need. The structure of the theme became inseparable from the opening sequence itself. The sequence was conceived and animated by David Silverman, who had been one of the 3 animators on the original Tracy Tracy Ullman shorts and who had carried his knowledge of the characters into the half-hour production. The sequence followed a logic of accumulation. The camera moved through clouds, through the Springfield sky, past the title, and then tracked each member of the family on their way home from wherever they had been spending their day. Homer left work at the power plant. Bart wrote something on the school chalkboard and escaped before he finished. Lisa played her saxophone in the school band rehearsal. Marge drove through the supermarket checkout with Maggie. The family converged on the couch in the living room, where something happened before the show began. What that something was changed every episode. The couch gag, as it became known, was initially a practical solution to a timing problem. Different episodes ran slightly different lengths in their actual content, and the opening sequence needed to adjust accordingly to bring the total runtime to the correct number of minutes. A shorter or longer couch gag could absorb the difference. But the device quickly became something more than a technical convenience. The writers and animators began treating the couch gag as its own small canvas, a space where anything could happen, where the rules of the show's realistic-ish universe did not apply, where pure visual absurdity was not only permitted but expected. Over the decades, couch gags have featured the family arriving in entirely different animation styles, celebrity animators taking over the sequence entirely, elaborate parodies of other films and television shows, and events that defied all internal logic in ways that somehow felt completely appropriate for the 30 seconds they occupied. Bart's chalkboard sentence changed with similar regularity. The opening showed him writing repetitive sentences as punishment, a punishment Groening himself had experienced in school and remembered clearly. The content of what he wrote became a small running joke across seasons, a place where the writers could put observations that did not fit anywhere else, absurdist statements and subtle commentary, and occasionally just something that was funny to see a 10-year-old being forced to write 24 times in a row. Lisa's saxophone solo in the opening sequence varied as well, and over the years this particular element became its own kind of archive of collaboration. Guest performers occasionally provided their own versions of the theme. The noise rock band Sonic Youth recorded a version that aired at the end of an episode, which Groening and others on the staff later named among their favorites. Green Day recorded a version for the Simpsons movie in 2007. Los Lobos contributed a version. Yo La Tengo and Sigur Rós and other bands brought their own approaches to the same recognizable melody. The theme proved, across all of these different treatments, to have the quality that separates durable music from merely popular music. It could absorb radically different styles and still be recognizable. The underlying structure was strong enough to survive almost any treatment applied to it. Elfman has said in interviews that the theme earns him a royalty payment every time it airs anywhere in the world, a figure he has joked about by quoting specific small amounts, noting that it is modest per instance but accumulates impressively given how many instances there are across how many markets over how many decades. He has also described what it means to travel internationally and find that the only piece of his work anyone in a given country immediately recognizes is the 60 seconds he wrote in a car on the way home from a meeting. He scored over 100 films and television productions across his career. The one that follows him everywhere, the one that needed no explanation in any language, was written faster than almost anything else he ever made. The theme accomplished something structurally important for the show. It established a kind of promise before every episode began. The music was not serious. It was not sad. It was not tense or uncertain. It was energetic and a little absurd and very confident about its own right to take up space. It told the audience that what was coming was going to be fast and strange, and that there was no need to settle into the cautious posture that serious television sometimes demanded. This gave the show permission to be many things across a single episode, funny and then genuinely touching and then satirical and then absurd, because the frame that held all of those tones together was established before the first scene appeared. That frame also created an expectation of consistency. The theme became one of the most played pieces of music in television history, heard by every person who watched the show across more than 3 decades, heard so many times by devoted viewers that the individual notes became indistinguishable from memory. There is a particular kind of familiarity that very few cultural artifacts achieve, the kind where the first note alone is enough to produce a full recognition and a corresponding emotion, not just identification, but something warmer and more immediate. The Simpsons theme crossed that threshold early and never retreated from it. The first note still produces that recognition in anyone who has ever watched the show, and for many people who have watched it across decades, it produces something closer to the feeling of arriving somewhere familiar. The opening sequence itself was revised twice across the show's run. The first revision came early in the second season, a refinement that adjusted some of the visual elements and sharpened the overall look without changing the fundamental structure. The second came in 2009, when the show transitioned to high-definition widescreen broadcasting. That transition transition required a complete rebuild of the sequence, and the production took the opportunity to make a new version that updated certain elements while honoring the logic and rhythm of the original. The new HD sequence retained the same structural movements and the same couch gag tradition, and the same family and motion accumulation, but added more visual depth and detail to Springfield itself, more characters visible in the background, more jokes happening in the periphery for attentive viewers to notice. The basic tempo of the theme was slightly adjusted, but its character was preserved. This second revision also introduced the possibility of different lengths for the couch gag, without disrupting the sequence's overall feel. The expanded flexibility allowed for longer, more elaborate couch gags that could spend more time on a single elaborate joke. Some of the most celebrated couch gags in the show's later seasons came in this expanded format, including a lengthy sequence animated by the French artist Sylvain Chaumet that transformed the entire opening into something that felt like a different film entirely. The show was by that point old enough that its opening sequence had become a canvas that external artists wanted to work on, and the production was confident enough to let them, knowing that the theme underneath would hold everything together regardless of what happened visually above it. The relationship between the music and the visuals in those 60 seconds captures something essential about how The Simpsons worked as an object in the world. The show was, technically and structurally, a collaboration between many people across many departments, but its audience experienced it as a single coherent voice. The theme was written by a composer who was brought in from outside and who had met the creator through an unfavorable concert review. The opening sequence was built by an animator who had been one of 3 people working on the original Tracy Ullman shorts in a building that had no real studio space for the purpose. The couch gags were written by a rotating group of writers who changed from season to season. And yet the total result felt, and continues to feel, like a single deliberate statement. The 60 seconds before every episode said the same thing every time. This is Springfield. These are the Simpsons. Something is about to happen that is unlike anything else on television, and it has been happening for longer than almost anyone expected. Elfman himself has noted the strange asymmetry of his career, the way the most enduring piece of work he produced was also among the least labor-intensive. There is something in that observation worth sitting with. The thing that lasts is not always the thing that costs the most. Sometimes the thing that lasts is the melody that came on the drive home, that was already finished before the composer walked through his own front door, that required only the recognition of a good idea and the discipline not to improve it into something worse. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The theme that Danny Elfman wrote in a car became the sound of an era, and the opening sequence it carried became one of the most analyzed 60 seconds in the history of animation. Next comes the period when the show reached the very top of what television comedy could do, and the writers who made that happen before most of them left. Section 5. The Golden Age and the writers who built it. Somewhere between the 3rd and 8th seasons of The Simpsons, the show achieved something that almost never happens in the long run of a successful television series. It stopped being merely popular and became genuinely great. The distinction matters. Plenty of shows are popular. Very few are great, in the sense that scholars and critics and serious students of the form use that word when they mean it carefully. The Simpsons, during a specific window of roughly 6 seasons that fans and critics would later spend considerable energy trying to define and defend, produced work that belonged in a different category from what the medium had managed before. The argument about where the Golden Age begins and ends has never been fully settled. Some place the start in the 3rd season, when Al John and Mike Rice became showrunners and the room's confidence reached a new pitch. Others include the first 2 seasons within it, arguing that even the rougher early episodes carry the DNA of what would come. The end of the Golden Era is similarly disputed, with opinions ranging from the end of season 8 to somewhere in the middle of season 10, depending on which episodes a particular viewer finds unforgivable. But the center of the argument, the seasons that almost nobody argues against, runs from roughly the 3rd season through the 7th. What made them that way is easier to describe than to explain. The writing in those seasons operated at a density that required effort to fully appreciate. A scene that appeared to be a simple joke about Homer's relationship with food was also a precise observation about the psychology of desire. An episode that seemed to be about Bart's friendship with a retired baseball player was also a meditation on loyalty and disappointment and what it means to be recognized too late. The show worked on multiple levels simultaneously, and the multiple levels were not achieved by making the surface joke worse. The surface joke was usually also excellent. The layers sat underneath it without disturbing it, available to the viewer who went looking and invisible to the viewer who did not. The writers responsible for this were, by the standards of television production, an unusually educated and competitive group. The room in those peak seasons was full full of people who had attended elite universities and who had already established themselves as talented before arriving at The Simpsons. Conan O'Brien, who would later become a celebrated late-night host, wrote for the show in its early seasons and contributed several episodes that are routinely named among the series' finest. Greg Daniels, who would later create the American version of The Office and Parks and Recreation, worked on the show during the Golden Era and brought a gift for character detail that deepened the supporting cast in lasting ways. John Swartzwelder, who never appeared on television and rarely gave interviews and wrote in hermetic isolation, contributed 60 episodes across the show's run, and his sensibility, a kind of precise logical absurdism that followed its own internal rules wherever they led, shaped the show's comic voice in ways that other writers have spent years trying to articulate. The Room's process has been described by many who participated in it as unlike any other experience in television writing. Scripts went through collective rewriting sessions in which every line was subject to challenge and replacement and improvement. A joke that worked at a table read might be cut by the time filming began because someone in the room had thought of something better during the intervening days. A line that seemed complete might be found to have a funnier version buried inside it if the room kept pushing. The standard for what was good enough was set high and moved higher. Writers who came from other rooms sometimes found the process disorienting at first because the assumption was not that a good draft was a finished draft, but that a good draft was a starting point for making something better. This collective standard produced episodes that felt tightly constructed in a way that most television comedy does not. There was very little waste. Jokes that appeared to be throwaway background details often turned out to be setups for something that arrived 12 minutes later. Characters who appeared briefly in Act 1 returned at precisely the right moment in Act 3. The Springfield universe, across those seasons, developed a kind of internal consistency that allowed the writers to make references to previous episodes and previous character moments and trust that the audience who had been paying attention would recognize them and feel rewarded. The supporting cast grew deeper and stranger during this period in ways that added to the show's sense of a fully inhabited world. Mo Shislak moved from a simple bartender who took Bart's prank calls into a character with genuine pathos underneath the sourness, a man whose disappointments were specific and real enough to generate sympathy alongside the comedy. Ned Flanders, who Harry Shearer himself has said was initially conceived as just a neighbor for Homer to resent, became a portrait of earnest faith so precise that it managed to be both funny and genuinely kind, never quite tipping into mockery, always locating the real human being inside the particular. Chief Wiggum's stupidity was given consistent internal logic. Krusty the Clown's self-destruction followed a recognizable pattern. Even minor characters who appeared in a single scene were written with enough specificity to feel like people rather than placeholders. The show also developed a relationship with celebrity guests during this period that was unlike any other program on television. The guest casting philosophy was simple in principle and demanding in execution. Celebrities who appeared on the show were expected to serve the story, not the other way around. If a famous person agreed to appear, the writing room did not adjust the episode to accommodate them. The episode existed first, and the celebrity was chosen because their particular quality, their voice, their persona, their cultural meaning, fit something the story already needed. The result was a guest list that included a range of famous names across music, film, sports, and public life, none of whom felt inserted or promotional, all of whom felt like they belonged in the scene where they appeared. The Golden Era also produced the show's most celebrated individual episodes, the ones that appear repeatedly on best of lists, and that people who watched the show in those years still quote with the accuracy of someone reciting something genuinely important to them. Marge vs. the Monorail, written by Conan O'Brien, built a pitch-perfect parody of big civic ambition around a con man selling Springfield a monorail it did not need. Cape Fear sent Sideshow Bob, Kelsey Grammer's operatically murderous villain, on a pursuit of Bart across a houseboat in the middle of a lake and filled the journey with jokes that operated on 3 or 4 levels simultaneously. Last Exit to Springfield took a story about a labor dispute at the power plant and turned it into a piece of sustained satirical intelligence about capitalism and collective action that would have been at home in serious literary fiction. Homer at the Bat assembled 9 active Major League Baseball players for a single episode and produced something that the Baseball Hall of Fame would formally honor more than 2 decades later. The Golden Era ended, and its ending has been the subject of as much analysis as its peak. Writers left. The people who had built the room and who had defined its standards could not stay forever. Conan O'Brien departed in 1993 to take over Late Night. Al Jean and Mike Reiss left after the 4th season. George Meyer stayed through the classic period but eventually departed in 2004. The writing room continued to be staffed by talented people, but talent is not the same as a shared sensibility, and a shared sensibility is not not the same as the particular combination of people who had inhabited a room at a specific moment in time. The magic that the early seasons had was partly technical and partly a matter of chemistry, and chemistry is the thing that cannot be manufactured on demand. The show kept going. The ratings remained strong enough to justify continued production. The characters kept appearing on screen every week, but something had shifted in the room, a change in the center of gravity that veteran viewers could feel even if they could not immediately name what they were feeling. The sharpness softened slightly. The layers became fewer. The show that had once operated at the density of a great novel began, gradually, to operate at the density of a very good sitcom. The distance between those two things is not enormous, but it is real, and it was felt. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Golden Era produced some of the finest television comedy ever written, and then the writers who made it began to leave, one by one. Next, the story of what happened when the show's most famous voice actor announced he was walking out the door, and the crisis that nobody was sure could be resolved. Section 6. The cast, the contracts, and the threats. Running a television show for long enough means eventually running into the question of what the people who make it are worth. In most industries, that question is resolved through negotiation, with both sides presenting their positions and arriving at a number somewhere between them. In the television industry, where certain performers become so associated with their roles that the role and the performer are functionally inseparable, the negotiation carries a different kind of weight. The threat that sits underneath every contract dispute in that situation is the threat that the product itself might cease to exist, or might be forced to become something fundamentally different from what audiences have come to expect. That threat is rarely made explicit in the early stages of a contract dispute, but it is always there. The 6 principal voice actors of The Simpsons had their first serious pay dispute with Fox in 1998. By that point, the show had been on the air for 9 years. It had won multiple Emmy Awards. It had generated billions of dollars in merchandise revenue. It had produced spin-off albums and comic books and video games and a theme park attraction. The characters voiced by Dan Castellaneta, Julie Kavner, Nancy Cartwright, Yeardley Smith, Hank Azaria, and Harry Shearer had become some of the most recognizable fictional people in the world. The actors themselves were earning $30,000 per episode. That number, measured against the show's commercial success, was the source of the dispute. The actors wanted more money and a share of the licensing and syndication revenue that the show had been generating. Fox's position, at least initially, was that the terms of the existing contracts were what they were, and that the network was not inclined to alter them simply because the show had become more successful than anyone had anticipated when the original deals were made. When the actors pressed harder, Fox escalated its response in a way that turned the dispute into something more serious. The network threatened to replace the entire cast with new voice actors. It went as far as hiring a casting director to begin the process of finding replacements. The practical reality of replacing the cast of The Simpsons was more complicated than Fox's threat suggested. The characters were not simply voices applied to drawings, they were specific performances developed across nearly a decade of work with precise emotional registers and comic rhythms that had been refined through thousands of hours of recording. Dan Castellaneta had spent years finding Homer's exact pitch of loving incompetence. Nancy Cartwright had built Bart's voice around a very specific quality of defiant vulnerability that sounded simple and was not. Harry Shearer alone was responsible for dozens of distinct characters, each maintained with a consistency that would require an extraordinary amount of work for any replacement performer to achieve. Matt Groening supported the actors publicly during the dispute, which complicated Fox's position and added pressure to the negotiations. A creator visibly backing his cast against the network that broadcast his show was unusual, and it signaled that any attempt to replace the performers would not have the cooperation of the show's most prominent creative figure. The dispute was eventually resolved without replacements. The 6 actors received raises that brought their per-episode salary to figures around $50,000, with provisions for further increases in subsequent seasons. It was a significant jump from where they had started, though still modest relative to what the show was generating. 3 years later, in 2001, negotiations went more smoothly. The cast reached an agreement for the 13th and 14th seasons at $100,000 per episode, rising to $125,000 for the 15th. Each actor also received a bonus payment in lieu of future syndication rights. The deal was made without the drama of the 1998 dispute, and the show continued without interruption. The 2004 negotiations did not go as smoothly. The show's revenue had continued to grow through strong syndication deals and DVD sales, and the cast took the position that their share of that revenue should reflect the show's ongoing commercial success. The 6 principal actors stopped appearing for scheduled table reads, which was a concrete disruption to the production process rather than merely a negotiating position. They were seeking $360,000 per episode. Fox countered lower. The standoff lasted about a month before a resolution was reached that brought salaries to somewhere between $250,000 and $360,000 per episode, depending on the actor. Fox, in response, shortened that season by one episode to offset some of the increased cost. The 2008 negotiations produced another escalation. The cast sought salaries approaching $500,000 per episode. Fox pushed back again, and the production of the 20th season was briefly placed on hold while the two sides worked toward an agreement. The resolution raised salaries to $400,000 per episode, a number that represented a remarkable distance from the $30,000 they had been earning a decade earlier. Then came 2011, and the dispute that was genuinely different from the ones that had preceded it. Fox announced that the show could not continue under its current cost structure. The network said it needed the cast to accept a salary reduction of roughly 45%, bringing per episode pay down from the $400,000 range. The alternative Fox presented was cancellation. The Simpsons would simply end rather than continue at the current cost. This was a more serious threat than the 1998 replacement warning, because it was aimed at the show's existence rather than the actors' positions within it. A cancelled Simpsons was a real possibility, and the actors knew it. The negotiations were prolonged and became public in a way that previous disputes had not been. Each side's position was reported extensively, and the pressure of that public attention sat over the process. Eventually, the actors accepted a reduction, bringing their salaries to approximately $300,000 per episode. Fox also negotiated a profit-sharing arrangement for the cast as part of the settlement, which provided a degree of compensation for the reduction and gave the actors a stake in the show's continued commercial performance. The show continued. Through all of these disputes, Harry Shearer was a consistent voice of opinion about the show's quality and direction, separate from the salary questions. He had publicly criticized what he saw as a decline in the writing. He had been vocal about specific episodes he believed had damaged the show's internal logic, most notably the season 9 episode that revealed Principal Skinner to be an imposter, a revelation that Shearer felt was disrespectful to the audience's investment in the character. He was not always comfortable being the person who said these things out loud while still being part of the production, but he said them anyway. In May 2015, Shearer announced on social media that he was leaving the show. The announcement was brief and public, made through a post that quoted language from the lawyer of executive producer James L. Brooks indicating that the show would continue without him. Shearer added only that he wished everyone involved the very best. The show's producers confirmed that Shearer had been offered the same contract terms as the other cast members and had declined. Al Jean, who had been showrunner for many seasons by that point, issued a statement saying the show must go on, without specifying what would happen to the many characters Shearer voiced. The list of what Shearer voiced was not short. He was responsible for Ned Flanders, Mr. Burns, Waylon Smithers, Principal Skinner, Kent Brockman, Otto Mann, Lenny Leonard, Scratchy, Kang, Reverend Lovejoy, Rainier Wolfcastle, and a considerable number of secondary and one-off characters across more than 2 decades of episodes. By some counts, he had voiced over 170 distinct characters during his time on the show. The prospect of replacing him, or retiring all of those characters simultaneously, or some combination of the two, was genuinely complicated in a way that the 1998 replacement threat had not quite been, because the 1998 threat was aimed at the whole cast, and therefore at the whole show. Shearer's departure was aimed at a specific portion of the show's fabric, a portion that happened to include some of its most beloved characters. On July 7, 2015, less than 2 months after the announcement, Shearer agreed to return. He accepted the terms the other cast members had accepted. The characters he voiced were safe. The specific details of what changed between May and July have never been fully disclosed, but the outcome was that Shearer was back in the recording booth and the cast was intact again. The brief public drama of the departure and return added one more chapter to the show's long history of contract negotiations conducted in the open. What the repeated salary disputes across those years reveal is something about the particular economics of a show that has been successful enough and long enough to create genuine leverage on both sides. Fox needed the show because it was a reliable and profitable piece of their Sunday night schedule and a cultural institution with value that extended well beyond its weekly ratings. The cast needed the show because it had, in the most literal sense, become what they were known for. Dan Castellaneta is Homer. Nancy Cartwright is Bart. The roles and the performers had become fused in the public mind in a way that made separation difficult for both parties. That mutual dependency shaped every negotiation, and it continues to shape whatever arrangements the production operates under today. What the salary timeline also reveals, looked at across its full arc, is a show that was perpetually arguing about its own value in real time. The numbers moved in one Direction across 22 years, from 30,000 per episode to 400,000, and then back down slightly under the pressure of the 2011 cancellation threat. Each upward movement reflected the cast's growing understanding of what the show was worth commercially, and each resistance from Fox reflected the network's awareness that the same mutual dependency that gave the actors leverage also placed a ceiling on how far they could push before the show itself became the casualty. The 2011 dispute was qualitatively different from the ones before it, not only because of the cancellation threat, but because of the atmosphere surrounding it. By that point, the show had been on the air for 22 seasons. The cultural conversation around it had shifted considerably from the golden era, when critics had been writing seriously about its achievements. The dominant tone in entertainment journalism by 2011 was one of mild affection mixed with the assumption of decline. The show was regarded by many observers as a long-running institution that had outlasted its creative peak by a significant margin. The question being asked was no longer whether the show was excellent, but whether it remained worth producing at all at its current cost. Fox's cancellation threat landed differently in that context than a similar threat would have landed in 1998, when the show was still widely considered essential viewing. In 2011, the threat had a reasonableness to it that the actors could not simply dismiss, because the audience had already been quietly making the same calculation for years. The resolution that brought salaries down to roughly $300,000 per episode included, as noted, a profit-sharing arrangement. That arrangement was structurally significant because it changed the actors' relationship to the show's commercial performance. Under the previous salary structure, the cast was paid a flat fee regardless of how the show performed. Under the new arrangement, they had a stake in outcomes. If the show generated more revenue, they shared in more of it. The alignment of incentives was not perfect, but it was different from what had come before, and it meant that the actors' financial futures were now tied more directly to the show's continued health than any previous contract had required. The season 10 episode Homer to the Max, which aired in February 1999, just months after the 1998 salary dispute had been resolved, contained a brief scene in which Homer observed to his family that television networks loved animated shows because they did not have to pay the voice actors very much. Ned Flanders appeared in the doorway and added that the networks could replace the voices and nobody would be able to tell the difference. For the sake of delivering that joke, showrunner Mike Scully voiced Ned Flanders himself rather than using Harry Shearer, making the replacement literal at the precise moment the dialogue was making the replacement point. The gag was noticed, and it had a particular sharpness given its timing, arriving in a season produced immediately after the dispute in which Fox had genuinely explored replacing the cast with new voices. The show was commenting on its own recent near disaster from inside the 10th season that the near disaster had helped make possible. Harry Shearer's 2015 departure and return added a final significant chapter to the cast's contract history before the show entered its most recent renewal cycles. What made Shearer's situation unusual was not the money, though the money was part of it. Sources familiar with the negotiations at the time reported that Shearer had also been seeking more flexibility in his schedule, a desire to be able to take on other projects without the recording obligations of The Simpsons creating conflicts. The show's recording schedule was demanding in ways that went beyond the financial calculation. Principal recording sessions ran twice weekly during the production period. For a performer with the breadth of characters Shearer maintained on the show, those sessions were not brief. Keeping that commitment across a full season meant keeping that portion of the calendar protected from anything else. Shearer, who had maintained a separate music career and had continued to perform and record outside the show, wanted more room. The eventual resolution appears to have addressed this alongside the financial terms, though the details remain private. What the complete salary history of The Simpsons demonstrates, read as a single document, is that the people most responsible for the show's identity, the 6 performers who had voiced its central characters from the beginning, and whose work was the most direct expression of what Springfield sounded like, understood their own position clearly and were willing to use it. They did not accept the first offer in 1998. They did not back down from the 2004 walkout for more than a month. They did not capitulate entirely in 2011, accepting a reduction but securing a share of future profits in return. Each negotiation was a version of the same argument, made with increasing sophistication and better legal representation as the decades passed. The argument was that the show would not be The Simpsons without the voices that had defined it since 1989, and that the commercial value of those voices deserved to be reflected in the compensation those voices received. Fox, over time, agreed with the argument enough to keep signing the contracts, and the voices kept coming back to the recording booth. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The cast fought for their share of what the show had become, and the the show survived every dispute without losing a single principal performer permanently. Next, the story of what happened to two characters who could not survive the deaths of the men who gave them their voices, and what the show chose to do about it. The entire structure of a long-running production assumes continuity. The same characters, the same voices, the same relationships maintained across hundreds of episodes and many years, with the expectation that what the audience has come to rely on will still be there the following week. Death does not respect that expectation. When a performer who has become genuinely inseparable from a role dies, the production faces a question that has no clean answer. Recast the role and ask audiences to accept a different voice in a familiar place, or retire the character and acknowledge that something irreplaceable has been lost. Both choices carry costs. The Simpsons, over the course of its long run, faced that question more than once, and the choices it made in response say something real about what the show understood about its own identity. Phil Hartman arrived on The Simpsons in 1991, in the second season episode where Bart was hit by a car and required legal representation. The character Hartman voiced in that episode was a lawyer named Lionel Hutz, a man of spectacular professional incompetence and breathtaking ethical flexibility, a person who had somehow passed a bar examination and yet approached every legal situation with the creativity of someone who had not read a single relevant law. Hutz was originally intended as a single appearance, a one-off joke character brought in for a specific story and then released back into the Springfield background. But Hartman was so immediate and so right in the role that the writing staff kept finding reasons to bring him back. Hutz appeared across 4 seasons in stories that required legal representation of various kinds, winning cases he should have lost and losing cases he should have won with equal comedy. The second character Hartman developed for the show was Troy McClure, a washed-up actor who introduced himself in every appearance with a variation on the same formula, naming the projects the audience might remember him from, works that ranged from the obscure to the imaginary to the genuinely alarming. McClure hosted infomercials. He appeared in educational films about topics no educational film had previously covered. He narrated retrospectives and guided tours and informational segments, always with the same glossy confidence of a man who had decided that visible enthusiasm could substitute for actual substance. Hartman has been quoted saying that Troy McClure was his personal favorite among all the roles he ever played, the character he felt most comfortable inside, and that he would most happily have continued indefinitely. He apparently used the McClure voice to entertain colleagues between takes on other productions. There had been early conversations about a live-action Troy McClure film that Hartman was genuinely excited about, a project he was reportedly prepared to fund partially himself. None of that happened. On May 28, 1998, Phil Hartman was murdered at his home in Encino, California. His wife, Bryn Omdahl, shot him in the early hours of the morning while he slept, then drove to the home of a friend, disclosed what had happened, and took her own life before police could reach her. Hartman was 49 years old. He had appeared in 52 episodes of The Simpsons across 9 seasons, voicing 19 different characters. The day his death became public, rehearsals for The Simpsons and performances by the Groundlings comedy group, which Hartman had long been associated with, were both cancelled in mourning. The production staff faced the question immediately: what happened to Hutz and McClure? The options were straightforward and neither was comfortable. A new actor could be brought in to continue both characters, which would require audiences to accept a different voice in roles they associated with a very specific performance. Or the characters could be retired, which meant losing 2 of the show's most popular supporting figures permanently. The staff chose retirement. Neither Hutz nor McClure was recast. Their final speaking appearances remained the episodes they had already recorded. Hutz spoke for the last time in the season 9 episode that aired shortly before Hartman's death. McClure's final speaking appearance came in the season 10 episode Bart the Mother, which was dedicated to Hartman and which aired 4 months after his murder. Both characters have appeared in subsequent episodes as silent background figures, glimpsed in a crowd or visible in a wide shot of Springfield, present but mute. The choice to keep them visible in that limited way reads as something between tribute and acknowledgement, a refusal to pretend they never existed alongside a refusal to pretend someone else could do what Hartman had done. Matt Groening wrote a tribute to Hartman in a Simpsons comic book shortly after his death, saying that Hartman could extract the maximum possible humor from any line he was given, and could make a funny line even funnier, a quality that is less common than it sounds and that the show had relied on across 9 seasons without fully accounting for how much it was depending on it until it was gone. The show found an indirect way to honor Hartman's memory beyond the show itself. Groening had been developing a new animated series called Futurama, set in the year 3000 and following a pizza delivery man who woke up in the future. The series needed a voice for a character named Zap Brannigan, a pompous and deluded military military commander, whose self-regard exceeded his actual competence in ways that were supposed to be immediately funny. Groening had written the character with Hartman in mind and had expected him to voice it. When Hartman died before production began in earnest, the character was recast, eventually voiced by Billy West, but Groening gave the show's protagonist a full name that he had not originally planned. The character became Philip J. Fry. The first name was chosen as a quiet tribute to Philip Hartman, the performer the show had expected to welcome and then lost before he could arrive. The grief the cast and staff felt about Hartman's death was genuine and specific, the loss of a colleague who had been, by every account from people who worked with him, unusually pleasant and generous. Unlike some performers whose talent was accompanied by difficulty, Hartman was remembered as easy to work with, warm in the recording booth, someone who made the work of the people around him easier rather than harder. The contrast between the ordinariness of who he was as a colleague and the violence of how he died gave the loss a particular quality that people who knew him have described in interviews across the years since. The Simpsons also lost, though in a different and quieter way, another significant voice during this same general period. Doris Grau had been a script supervisor on the production and had provided the voice of a recurring cafeteria worker named Lunch Lady Doris, a figure defined by spectacular indifference to the nutritional content of what she served. Grau died in December 1995. Lunch Lady Doris appeared occasionally in subsequent seasons without speaking, then was eventually recast with a new voice actress in later years. The handling of her character was less ceremonial than the handling of Hartman's characters, partly because Lunch Lady Doris was a secondary figure rather than a major recurring presence, and partly because the circumstances of the two losses were different. But the pattern was the same: an initial period of silence following a death, a reluctance to simply fill the absence with a different voice, as though the original had not existed. Marcia Wallace, who voiced Edna Crabapple, Bart's fourth-grade teacher, died in October 2013. Crabapple had appeared in the show since the second season and had accumulated across that time into one of Springfield's most genuinely complex supporting characters, a woman whose initial presentation as a tired and slightly contemptuous teacher had deepened across years of episodes into something more sympathetic, someone whose disappointments were real and whose small moments of connection with her students, and eventually with Ned Flanders, whom she married in a later season, carried genuine emotional weight. Wallace won a Primetime Emmy Award for her portrayal in 1992, the first Emmy given for voice acting on the show. When Wallace died, the production retired Crabapple rather than recasting her. The character's passing was acknowledged within the show's narrative in a brief tribute that appeared in a season 25 episode, a chalkboard message during the opening sequence that said simply that the show would miss her. Ned Flanders was written as a widower from that point forward. The choice to retire Crabapple honored both the performer and the character's place in the show's emotional landscape, a recognition that some things cannot be continued once the specific person who gave them life is gone. What these retirements accumulated into, across the show's long run, was an unofficial policy that was never formally announced, but that expressed itself consistently through practice. When a performer who had become genuinely embedded in the show's texture died, the characters they voiced were not handed to someone else. The show absorbed the loss and continued around the absence. This was not true of every supporting character. Roles that had changed hands through living performers' departures, characters that multiple actors had voiced across the show's history, were treated differently. But the deaths of performers who had made specific characters genuinely their own produced a consistent response: retirement rather than replacement, tribute rather than continuity. The accumulated effect of those choices gives The Simpsons an unusual quality among very long-running productions. The show carries its losses visibly. The absence of Hutz and McClure is a presence in the Springfield universe, a shape defined by what is no longer there. The silence of Lunch Lady Doris for years before her eventual recast, the chalkboard message that acknowledged Krabappel's passing. These moments are not typical of how television handles the practical problems created by a performer's death. They reflect something about what the production understood itself to be, not simply a delivery mechanism for weekly entertainment, but a long-running accumulation of specific performances, specific voices, specific people who had become part of what the show was. Losing those people was not simply a logistical problem to be solved. It was a real loss, and the show treated it as one. Phil Hartman appeared in 52 episodes across 9 seasons. His characters were retired the moment he was gone. The live-action Troy McClure film was never made. The Zapp Brannigan role was given to someone else. And somewhere in the background of Springfield, in the crowd scenes and the wide shots, a silent figure in a bad suit still occasionally appears, present in the only way the show could manage, as a shape where a voice used to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show honored the performers it lost by preserving the silence their absence created. Next, the story of how The Simpsons became known not only for what it had already done, but for what it appeared to know was coming, and why the reputation for predicting the future is more complicated than it seems. Section 8. The show that knew too much. Sometime around the middle of the second decade of the 21st century, a particular kind of article began appearing with reliable regularity across the internet. The format was consistent: a screenshot from an old Simpsons episode, placed next to a photograph of a recent real-world event. A caption explaining that the episode had aired years or sometimes decades before the event it appeared to depict. A tone of hushed amazement, as though the writers of an animated sitcom from the early 1990s had somehow gained access to information about a future they could not possibly have seen. The article spread quickly, shared by people who found the juxtapositions genuinely striking and who were happy to describe the show using a word the show itself had never claimed for itself. The word was prophetic. The prediction reputation grew from a specific combination of factors, and understanding those factors is more interesting than simply listing the examples, because the examples without the context tell a story that is not quite true. The Simpsons has been running continuously since 1989, producing between 15 and 22 episodes per year across more than 3 decades. The total number of episodes as of the show's 37th season exceeded 800. 800 episodes of satirical comedy about American life, each containing multiple jokes and visual gags and throwaway background details, produced by writers who were paid to pay attention to the world and find the funny version of what was happening in it. 800 episodes is an enormous number of chances. Probability alone, applied to that volume of material, guarantees that some percentage of the jokes will eventually match something that happens in reality. The show did not predict the future. The show produced enough material that the future was eventually going to catch up with some of it. Al John, who served as showrunner for many of the show's seasons and who has been the production's longest-serving executive producer, has said publicly that the apparent predictions are best understood as educated guesses, and that if enough darts are thrown, some of them will hit the target. The writers were not working with special knowledge. They were working with careful observation of existing trends and a willingness to follow those trends to their logical and often absurd conclusions. Satire operates by taking something real and extending it until the extension reveals something about the original. When satire is good enough, the extension sometimes turns out to be closer to reality than the writer intended, because reality has a tendency to become stranger than the satirist expected it to. The most discussed of the apparent predictions concerns an episode from the year 2000, in season 11, called Bart to the Future. The episode showed Lisa Simpson as President of the United States, having succeeded a previous president named Trump. The episode was intended as a joke about a particular kind of excessive wealth and the cultural space it occupied in American life at the turn of the millennium. Donald Trump had been a figure of tabloid celebrity for years and had floated the idea of a presidential run in ways that most observers treated as publicity rather than genuine political ambition. The joke in the episode was that a country run by someone of that sensibility would leave a catastrophic economic mess for whoever came next. The writers were satirizing a type, not predicting a person. 16 years later, the type became the person, and the episode was everywhere. The Disney acquisition example operates differently and is in some ways more genuinely impressive as a piece of apparent foresight. In a season 10 episode from 1998, a throwaway visual gag showed a sign identifying the 20th Century Fox network as a division of the Walt Disney Company. The joke was aimed at the consolidation of media ownership, a trend that was clearly underway in the late 1990s, and that the writers were satirizing in the background of a scene that was about something else entirely. 21 years later, Disney completed its acquisition of 21st Century Fox, which meant that The Simpsons, a show that had mocked the idea of Fox being owned by Disney, was now actually owned by Disney. The irony of the show predicting its own corporate future while trying to mock corporate consolidation is the kind of thing that generates genuine delight, because it happened to the show itself rather than to some external target. The smartwatch example is more ambiguous and illustrates how the prediction narrative tends to flatten important distinctions. A 1995 episode set in the future showed a character communicating through a device worn on the wrist. The image has been widely cited as a prediction of the Apple Watch and similar devices. The problem with that framing is that wrist-based communication devices had been a staple of science fiction and forward-looking design for decades before the Simpsons episode aired. The Jetsons featured them. Dick Tracy featured a two-way wrist radio in the comic strip from 1946. The concept was not invented by the Simpsons writing room. The writers placed a wrist device in a future set episode because wrist devices were the accepted shorthand for futuristic communication that popular culture had already established. established. The coincidence is not between the episode and the future. It is between the episode and a future that was already being anticipated by everyone paying attention to technology. The Nobel Prize episode is perhaps the most specific and therefore the most striking of the legitimate prediction cases. In a 2010 episode, a character held up a sign bearing the name Bengt Holmström alongside the suggestion that he would win the Nobel Prize in economics. Holmström was a real economist, a professor at MIT, whose theoretical work on contract design and incentive structures was genuinely significant, but who was not at that moment a widely discussed candidate for the prize. 6 years after the episode aired, in 2016, the Nobel Committee awarded Holmström the prize in economics. This case cannot be fully explained by the volume argument or by the observation that the writers were following existing trends. Someone in the writing room either knew enough about economic theory to identify Holmström as a serious candidate years before the committee reached the same conclusion, or happened to choose a name that turned out to be correct in a way that defies easy explanation. It remains one of the cases in the prediction catalog that serious analysis has not fully resolved. The U.S. curling victory at the Winter Olympics is another case that sits in the more genuinely impressive category. A 2010 episode showed Homer and Marge winning gold medals in curling for the United States, beating Sweden in the final. 8 years later, at the 2018 Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, the United States men's curling team won the country's first ever Olympic gold medal in the sport, defeating Sweden in the final. The sport, the opponent, the outcome, and the general improbability of the event were all present in the episode. The writers were presumably making a joke about unlikely athletic achievements, and the joke happened to be precisely accurate in ways that went beyond what the probability argument can comfortably explain. What fact-checking organizations have found when they examine the full catalog of claimed predictions is a picture that is more varied and more honest than the celebratory articles suggest. A meaningful number of the most widely shared examples turn out, on examination, to be inaccurate. The screenshots have sometimes been altered. The dates have sometimes been misrepresented, with episodes claimed to have aired before a real event that they actually aired after. Some of the juxtapositions require squinting at the comparison until it becomes convincing, a process that says more about human pattern recognition than about the show's foresight. A substantial portion of the catalog dissolves under careful scrutiny. What remains after the dissolving is still interesting, but interesting for different reasons than the prophecy narrative suggests. The Simpsons is a show that, at its best, paid serious attention to the world and had writers capable of identifying the directions in which that world was moving. When the writing was sharpest, the satire pointed at real tendencies in real institutions in ways that sometimes turned out to be more accurate than the writers intended, because those tendencies continued developing in the directions the writers had identified. That is not prediction in any supernatural sense. It is the natural consequence of intelligent, well-informed observation extended through satire over a very long period of time. The show has also been entirely wrong, repeatedly and spectacularly, about many things it appeared to predict. For every curling victory, there are dozens of future set jokes whose futures arrived and turned out to look nothing like the episode imagined. The prediction catalog never includes these. It includes only the matches, which creates a deeply misleading impression of the ratio between hits and misses. The hits feel remarkable because they are surfaced and shared and amplified. The misses vanish because nobody is looking for them or interested in finding them. There is something worth noting about what the prediction reputation has done to the show's cultural standing in its later decades. During the golden era, the show was celebrated for what it actually was, a piece of exceptional comedy writing that happened to be animated. The prediction conversation, which became most intense during a period when the show's writing quality was widely considered to have declined significantly from its peak, shifted the terms of the show's cultural relevance. The Simpsons stopped being discussed primarily as a comedy and started being discussed primarily as an oracle. People who had not watched a new episode in 15 years were sharing articles about its predictive powers. The show was being credited with a quality it did not claim and had never tried to develop, while the qualities it had actually developed and that had made it genuinely extraordinary received less attention. The writers themselves have been largely modest about the whole phenomenon, acknowledging the coincidences with good humor while declining to take credit for anything beyond observation and the occasional fortunate guess. That modesty is probably accurate, and it is certainly more honest than the alternative. The Simpsons did not see the future. It watched the present closely enough that the future occasionally arrived looking familiar. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The prediction reputation gave the show a second kind of fame separate from its comedy, but the show's actual relationship with the future was always more ordinary and more interesting than the mythology suggested. Next comes the story of the the moment the show went to the cinema, and what happened when a family that had lived on television for nearly 2 decades was finally given a screen large enough to fill. Section 9. The movie and the machine that kept running getting The Simpsons. Movie made took longer than the production of most actual films, longer than the development of most television seasons, and longer than anyone involved was comfortable admitting in the early years when the project kept stalling. The idea of a feature-length Simpsons film had been discussed almost since the show began. James L. Brooks had floated the possibility as early as the show's 4th season, when the episode Camp Krusty was being developed. The story of Bart and other Springfield children being sent to a dismal summer camp run by a Krusty the Clown imposter had enough narrative scope, in Brooks's view, to potentially support a full theatrical release rather than a 22-minute television episode. The idea was explored and then set aside, partly because the writers discovered that even stretching the premise to episode length required effort, and a feature film would have required something more substantial. The something more substantial proved difficult to find. Throughout the 1990s, at various points when the show was at or near its creative peak and when its commercial success would have made a theatrical release a straightforward proposition, the film kept not happening. The problem was consistently the script. A Simpsons film required a story large enough to justify the format, one that could not simply be a long episode but had to earn the scale the cinema demanded. The writers were capable of producing exceptional episodic television, but the logic of a film is different from the logic of a 22-minute story. A film has to build across 90 minutes to something that feels genuinely conclusive, a narrative arc with real stakes that land in a satisfying place. The episodic structure the writers had spent years mastering was, in some ways, the wrong preparation for the problem they needed to solve. Various story ideas were proposed and abandoned during the 1990s. Various structural approaches were tried and found wanting. The creative team was not willing to release a film simply because a film was commercially desirable. The standard they held themselves to, particularly during the golden era when the show's sense of its own quality was at its most acute, was high enough that a script which was merely good rather than genuinely excellent was not going to be approved. The film kept waiting for the right idea, and the right idea kept not arriving. In 2001, a new attempt began in earnest. By this point, the voice cast had agreed to participate in a film, which removed one significant obstacle. A team of writers assembled to develop a story, and the process that followed was by all accounts one of the more unusual production experiences in recent animation history. Over the next 6 years, the script went through roughly 100 different versions. Scenes were written and cut and rewritten. Story structures were proposed and abandoned and proposed again in different forms. Characters were added and removed. The central premise shifted more than once. The writers approached the work with the same collective rewriting process that had defined the television production, but scaled to the demands of a feature narrative, which meant that the process of finding the right version took much longer. The premise that eventually survived all of that rewriting placed Homer at the center of an environmental catastrophe. Springfield's lake, after years of pollution, received a warning from the Environmental Protection Agency. The town made a genuine effort to clean it up. Homer, through a sequence of decisions that were individually understandable and collectively catastrophic, dumped the contents of a silo full of pig waste into the lake and triggered the disaster the town had just finished working to prevent. The EPA, led by a bureaucrat named Russ Cargill, responded by encasing the entire town of Springfield under a massive glass dome. The Simpson family was forced out of Springfield by their furious neighbors. Homer and Marge's relationship reached a crisis. The family separated. The film's second half followed Homer's attempt to find a reason to act when acting had never been his strong suit, and to save a town whose destruction was his fault. The production team made a deliberate decision to animate the film using traditional methods rather than the computer-generated imagery that had become the dominant approach for theatrical animation by the mid-2000s. Pixar had established computer-generated imagery as the commercial standard for animated features, and DreamWorks and other studios had followed. The Simpsons team chose to stay with the hand-drawn style that had defined the television series, updated and refined for theatrical presentation, but recognizable as the same visual world audiences had been watching for nearly 2 decades. The choice was partly philosophical and partly practical. The characters existed in a specific drawn universe, and putting them in a different kind of animation would have been a version of making a different film. The Simpsons needed to look like The Simpsons. The film went through test screenings in Portland, Oregon and Phoenix, Arizona in early 2007. The Portland location was a choice with meaning, since Groening was from Portland and the city had a long-standing connection to the show's mythology. The test audiences responded well, but with specific feedback that led to further revisions. A car chase sequence involving flaming mummies was removed and replaced with scenes at a motel and a carnival that allowed for a change of emotional pace and a more grounded depiction of the family's situation. The sequence where Bart skateboarded through Springfield naked, which was Groening's idea and had been part of the film for some time, survived the screening process intact, as did the brief moment that followed where his anatomy was briefly visible. The production team had worried about whether that gag would produce an R rating from the Motion Picture Association of America, but the rating came back as PG-13 for irreverent humor throughout, which was what they had hoped for. The release campaign was among the most elaborate mounted for an animated film up to that point. 7-Eleven, the convenience store chain, transformed 11 of its American locations and one Canadian location into quick E-Mart themed stores for the promotional period, complete with Springfield-branded food and drink products. The conversion cost approximately $10 million and produced a reported 30% increase in sales for the altered locations during the promotional window. Burger King produced a line of Simpsons toy figures. The film was banned in Myanmar not for any content reason, but because the excessive use of yellow and red in its imagery violated that country's restrictions on certain color combinations. A giant pink donut was erected in a town called Springfield in Canterbury, New Zealand. A floating inflatable spider pig, a pig that had become significant to the film's plot, was installed near the Battersea Power Station in London. The film opened on July 27, 2007, in the middle of the summer season, competing with Transformers, Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, and The Bourne Ultimatum. It debuted at number 1 with an opening weekend of just over $74 million, nearly matching the film's entire reported production budget of $75 million in its first 3 days. Strong reviews and a clear public desire to see The Simpsons on a large screen drove the film to sustained performance across its theatrical run. The domestic total reached $183 million. The international total was more than $350 million. The worldwide gross landed at approximately $527 million, making it the 8th highest grossing film of 2007 and the highest grossing film based on an animated television series at the time of its release. No television-to-film adaptation except several of the Mission Impossible films had performed better in commercial terms. The reviews were genuinely positive in a way that surprised some observers who had assumed the film would be received as a nostalgia product rather than a piece of quality filmmaking. Critics noted that the film had found a story large enough to justify its format, that Homer's arc from irresponsible disaster to genuine accountability felt earned rather than manufactured, and that the film managed to recapture something of the energy and warmth of the golden era without simply being a long episode. The complaint that some reviewers raised was that the film, while good, did not feel as revolutionary as the show had felt at its peak, that it succeeded on the show's established terms rather than expanding what those terms could accomplish. That is a fair assessment of a film that set out to be an excellent version of itself rather than to invent a new form. The sequel question arrived almost immediately after the film's release. Brooks mentioned in subsequent years that Fox had expressed interest in a second film. Groening referenced the possibility in interviews. By 2018, it was officially announced that a sequel was in development. Years passed without further specific information. Then in 2025, the sequel was confirmed to be in active production, with a release date scheduled for September 2027. The details of the story have not been widely disclosed. The expectation is that the principal cast will return. The gap between the first and second films will be approximately 20 years, which is its own kind of record for a sequel timeline, and which reflects the same difficulty the first film encountered: the challenge of finding a story large enough and good enough to justify the format, rather than simply the commercial logic that would have produced a sequel within 3 or 4 years of the original. The film's cultural legacy in the years since its release has been complicated by what happened to the show in the period surrounding it. The television series in the years immediately before the film was widely regarded as operating well below its historic peak. The film briefly repositioned The Simpsons as something the culture was actively excited about rather than merely habituated to. People who had not watched a new episode in years went to the cinema to see the movie and were reminded of what the show had been at its best. That reminder was not enough to drive those same people back to weekly television viewing and sustain numbers, but it created a moment in which The Simpsons felt genuinely alive in the way it had felt alive during the golden era rather than simply continuing to exist. The television show kept running through all of it. Season after season, the production continued. The format changed in 2025 when Fox renewed the show for its 37th through 40th seasons, reducing the episode count from 22 per season to 15, with 2 additional episodes per season produced exclusively for the Disney streaming service. The reduction in episode count was described as a quality measure, an acknowledgement that producing fewer episodes per year might allow the writing room to invest more in each one. Whether that investment translated into into a genuine improvement in the work is a question that viewers and critics have continued to debate with the energy that any long-running show that once mattered enormously tends to generate from its most devoted observers. The 800th episode of the series aired on December 7, 2025, during season 37. The milestone received coverage and attention, the kind of round number recognition that journalism and culture extend to longevity as its own form of achievement. 800 episodes of a television show is a number so large that it becomes difficult to hold in the mind as a unit. It represents thousands of hours of animation, tens of thousands of individual jokes, hundreds of characters given voice across decades, a cast and crew that in some cases has worked together longer than many people's adult careers. The show that was sketched in a lobby in 1987 and aired its Christmas special in 1989 reached its 800th episode in 2025, still running, still producing, still sitting down at the table every week to figure out what happened next in Springfield. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The film proved the family could fill a screen larger than a television, and the machine that made them kept running long after the film returned to streaming. Next, the final chapter, where all of the threads come together, and the question of what it actually means for a cartoon to have lasted this long is given the time it deserves. The thing no longer needs to justify its continued existence by being the best version of itself at every moment. The fact that it is still there, still producing, still occupying the same space it has occupied for decades, becomes a kind of statement on its own terms. The Simpsons reached that point some years ago, and the question of whether reaching it was a triumph or a surrender has never been fully settled, because the honest answer is that it was probably both simultaneously, and that both can be true without either canceling out the other. The show that exists today is not the show that aired in 1990. This is obvious when stated directly, and yet somehow still surprising when encountered, because the characters look the same, and the town looks the same, and the title is the same, and the time slot on Sunday evenings on Fox is the same. The surface continuity is so complete that it can create the impression of a deeper continuity that does not actually exist. Homer is still Homer in the sense that Dan Castellaneta still voices him, and the character still lives on Evergreen Terrace, and still works at the nuclear power plant, and still loves donuts with a devotion that has never wavered. But the Homer of the golden era and the Homer of the current era are related the way a photograph of a person taken 30 years apart is related. The connection is real and the continuity is genuine, and something fundamental has changed that the photograph cannot fully capture. What changed is partly the writing, and partly something harder to name. The writing in the golden seasons operated with a specific kind of authority, the authority of people who had found exactly the right way to say something true about the world, and who trusted that the audience was capable of receiving it without assistance. The humor did not explain itself. The satire did not announce its targets before hitting them. The emotional moments arrived without preparation and landed harder for the lack of warning. The show trusted its audience in a way that has become less common as the decades have passed, not only in The Simpsons but in television generally, and the trust was not misplaced. The audience was capable of keeping up. In some cases, the audience was ahead, noticing things in the background that the writers had placed there as rewards for exactly that kind of attention. The harder thing to name is the sense of genuine surprise the early show carried. When The Simpsons was new, it felt genuinely new. It was doing something that had not been done before in American primetime television, taking a format that had been associated with wholesome simplicity and using it to say complicated and sometimes uncomfortable things about the way people actually live. The surprise was not just that it was animated, it was that it was honest in a way that mainstream television had largely avoided being, willing to depict a father who genuinely failed his family and found that admission funny rather than shameful, willing to let a 10-year-old boy be genuinely bad at school without the story requiring a lesson about the importance of studying, willing to show a small American town as a place full of self-serving institutions and comfortable hypocrisies without suggesting that the town was therefore beyond love. That honesty and the surprise it carried cannot be sustained indefinitely. A show that has been honest in the same ways for 35 years is no longer surprising in those ways. The honesty has become familiar, which is a form of success and also a kind of limitation. The show that once felt like a necessary corrective to the comfortable fictions of mainstream television now exists alongside dozens of animated comedies that followed in its wake, many of which have pushed further in the directions The Simpsons opened, many of which have developed their own distinct voices that owe an enormous debt to the show that proved the form was capable of serious work. The Simpsons is the ancestor of a tradition it invented, which means it now occupies a position within that tradition rather than standing outside it. The influence the show has had on everything that came after it is almost impossible to measure precisely because it is so pervasive. South Park and Family Guy, the two animated comedies that most explicitly positioned themselves in relationship to The Simpsons' legacy, each found different ways to take what the show had established and push against it, one through escalating transgression and political directness, the other through a different kind of structural experimentation and a more explicitly absurdist approach to family life. Futurama, Groening's own follow-up project, borrowed the collaborative writing approach and the willingness to embed genuine science and intellectual content in comedy, and built one of the most formally inventive animated series American television has produced. King of the Hill, created by Simpsons writer Greg Daniels alongside Mike Judge, applied the golden era's commitment to character depth and emotional honesty to a Texas setting and produced something as quietly excellent as anything The Simpsons itself made in its best years. The Simpsons is in all of them, not as imitation but as foundation. The people who made the show during its peak years have largely gone on to remarkable things, which is its own kind of testament to what The Room produced. Conan O'Brien became one of the longest-running hosts in late-night television history. Greg Daniels created and showran two of the most beloved workplace comedies of the 2000s. Brad Bird directed some of the most celebrated animated and live-action films of the past 25 years. Al Jean remained with the show longer than almost anyone, becoming the defining institutional continuity of its later decades. The show functioned during those early years as something close to the best training ground for comedy writing that American television had ever produced. A room where the standards were high enough and the work was hard enough that the people who passed through it came out with a set of skills and instincts that they carried into everything they did afterward. Matt Groening himself has remained the show's most visible creative presence across its entire run, even as the day-to-day creative authority shifted to successive showrunners. He developed Futurama in 1999, which ran for 4 seasons before being canceled by Fox and then revived twice, most recently for a new run beginning in 2023. He created Disenchantment for Netflix in 2018, a fantasy comedy that ran for 5 seasons. He has continued to be associated with The Simpsons as executive producer and creative consultant, appearing at panels and conventions and in press materials as the face of a show that has outlasted every reasonable prediction of how long it could go. His father, Homer Groening, died in 1996. His mother, Margaret, the real-world Marge, died in 2013 at the age of 94. The characters named after them are still on the air. The show's relationship with time is one of the stranger things about it. The Simpsons uses a floating timeline, which means the characters do not age, which means that Bart has been 10 years old for 35 years and shows no signs of turning 11. Homer entered middle age in 1989 and has remained there. The town of Springfield has changed governments and businesses and relationships across hundreds of episodes, while remaining somehow suspended in its own version of the present, always contemporary with whatever year is currently airing, never accumulating the weight of its own history in the way that a show with a linear timeline would. The floating timeline was a practical decision in the early years and became a defining feature of what the show is. Springfield exists outside of time in a way that is both technically convenient and philosophically interesting, a permanent present that borrows from every era it has passed through without being trapped in any of them. The show was renewed in 2025 through its 40th season, guaranteeing that the family from Evergreen Terrace will still be appearing on Fox at least through the 2028 to 2029 broadcast year. A sequel to The Simpsons movie is scheduled for release in September 2027, nearly 20 years after the original. The production that began with a rough sketch in a lobby that aired its first episode to 33 million viewers on a December evening in 1989, that generated $2 billion in merchandise revenue in its first 14 months, that survived contract disputes and cast departures and critical dismissal and the loss of performers who could not be replaced, that saw its creator's family name the President of the United States from a podium and fired back within 3 days, that produced 800 episodes and 1 film and gave its audience a vocabulary for talking about the world that people still use 35 years later, is still making new episodes. Whether those new episodes are worth watching is a question that different viewers answer differently based on what they are comparing the new episodes to. Compared to most television comedy being produced today, The Simpsons in its current form is a competent and often entertaining show. Compared to The Simpsons of the 3rd through 8th seasons, it is a different thing entirely. A show that shares the name and the characters and the town, but that operates at a different level of ambition and achieves a different quality of result. Both comparisons are true. Neither is the complete picture. What the complete picture includes is everything the show has been across its entire run: the lobby sketch and the crude animation, and the theme composed on a drive home, and the Christmas special that 33 million people watched, and the Bart Mania, and the president's speech and the writing room that trained a generation of comedy writers, and the deaths of performers whose characters were never recast, and the contract disputes and the movie, and the 800 episodes and the sequel still coming. The complete picture includes the show at its best, which was as good as American television comedy has ever been, and the show at its most diminished, which is still something that has outlasted virtually everything that was on television when it began. A cartoon family, yellow-skinned and rubber-limbed, drawn in a hurry by a man who was protecting his rights to a different cartoon, has been sitting on that couch in Springfield for 35 years. The music plays. Something happens before the show begins. The show begins. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.